I open the session for questions. Okay. So please tell us your name and who you direct your question to, but it's okay if it's for more than one person or...
Great. Thank you. I'm John Coonrod with the Hunger Project. So I was fascinated by this intersection between big sort of market-based economic policies and these micro-level issues, and particularly on enteropathy. I mean, what kind of policies or what kinds of market forces could cause a change in chickens being in the house? I don't even know if it's a standard part of most household surveys, are there chickens in the house or not? So, but that seems to me a huge issue. The other question had to do with, in the middle of that model of fuel tax reduction and nutrition. I'm just curious how that is linked.
Okay, we'll take a couple more. And so I guess this was for Derek, right? Okay. Oh, well, yeah, we'll stay on this side for now.
My name is Mondre, mortgage lessor with 1,000 days. Okay. All right. My name is Mondre with 1,000 days. Something that I was hoping to hear was a consideration around cultural norms and sort of myths around consumption and some of the programs that you're pushing. So for instance, the reason this came to my mind is you kept speaking about eggs, and where I come from, mothers don't consume eggs on the belief that children will be born board-headed. So it's just some of those nuances around when we push for something, the other variables that need to be taken into consideration.
Good question. And we'll take a couple on this side.
Hi, I'm Ahmed Kaplan, nutrition advisor with Feed the Future, USAID. Question to Derek and James. I'm glad to see your presentation, the linkages you made. See the poverty, double burden economy and prices. Also, they have the double burden in nutrition as well, so, or the triple burden to start with. Derek, I like your point that you made when you're looking at the calories, the quality of the calories rather than only the quantity of the calories. And I'm wondering also, I mean, there is not much research on the point of identifying what is the minimum requirement of animal source food that's needed, because it is critical in developing economies. We have the other side of the problem where we are shifting because we have overconsumption of animal source food or nutrient-rich diet, and we have the other problem. We don't want to export it to the other side, but also it is a critical ingredient, as you all mentioned, for improving nutritional outcome, reducing stunting and wasting. Thank you.
One more, and then we'll come back to the podium.
Hi, I'm Frank Place from IFPRI, the Policies, Institutions, and Markets Program. I guess this question goes to the analyst team. I was wondering about the issue of seasonality. If you were, with all your data sets and studies, you were able to probe that issue in terms of access to food across season and pricing of food, and whether that might have been mediated by, say, in bimodal versus unimodal systems or irrigation investments, things like that. Thanks.
Okay, so let's start with you, Derek.
Sure. The chickens issue, yeah, we've been thinking about that a lot. There's also part of a project led by Al Ogeli in Burkina Faso called Celever. And Celever is a value chain project, and what we're trying to do is tap on and experiment onto that to see whether we can also do interventions that reduce children's exposure to chickens and their feces. It's a bit unclear what to do. The Shine project felt that there was nothing they could do on the poultry. The problem is when you cage poultry, you need to adopt a bunch of other inputs too. You need to have improved feed, more water, more labor inputs, and for that to be profitable, you have to increase your scale too. So the transition from backyard poultry to more commercialized poultry for poor people is a pretty big transition. It costs nothing to own a few poultry. So that's why you see 90% of Burkina Faso is very poor country own poultry, because it's a low entry activity. But switching to commercial production is much more costly. So of course in Selavert we're trying to transition people into more commercial poultry, and maybe then they will adopt poultry housing. But even then, some may adopt, housing at night, but not do anything during the day, etc.
Can I add to that, Derek? Because the Shine project also tested the little playpen. Were you
Yeah.
going to say that?
I had that. I did
Oh,
that
sorry.
one.
Okay.
So
I thought you were moving
so
to another question. Sorry.
Shine said they couldn't pen the chickens, so let's pen the kids, basically.
Yeah.
And yeah, we don't know. I mean, that's interesting. They didn't seem to have the desired impacts, but we don't know how sustainable that is. I mean, the other thing we can just do is improve maternal knowledge. I think what we're thinking about in that context is integrating these livestock issues into community-led total sanitation, because it is a community problem. Poultry don't obey, fences, or even if fences existed, and it's a sort of knowledge problem as well. So in Burkina Faso, we found a lot of variation in how often people sweep the household and how clean the households are for no obvious reason, just individual norms. On the second question about eggs and cultural norms, I happen to be writing a paper on eggs at the moment, and I was quite surprised how widespread cultural norms are. The more common one I hear is that if you feed your child eggs, they'll become thieves. And
That's West Africa.
And even in Ethiopia too. So different places unconnected, you see that same thief. And then we've got a third problem, of course. About a third of Indians are vegetarian, including not eating eggs, so they might consume dairy products but not eggs. So there are many cultural challenges. We didn't look at all of them. I will say this, there's a strand of economics and anthropology that thinks that some of these cultural norms have an economic basis. So if eggs are 10 times as expensive as cereals, parents also wouldn't mind an excuse not to feed their kids eggs, because it's like feeding a child cash. Right? So many parts of Africa, you'll see people selling eggs on the side of the road. They won't eat them in their own household because they're too valuable. So bringing down the price of eggs, I still think, could help despite these cultural taboos. But I'm not saying behavioural change doesn't matter. We had a discussion last week on animal source food requirements. That's for nutritionists to decide, but I think that's really critical. Certainly in our work on dairy, it's quite striking. Dairy recommendations in the developed world that, don't give a child dairy products if they're younger than 12 months. And I'm not sure that's applicable to poor countries where they have so few animal source foods and so little high quality protein. On seasonality, I just couldn't get any more into 20 minutes. We did have some work on seasonality. Really struggled to do that sometimes because the data requirements are so large. You need high frequency surveys. One work that I think was quite interesting, Kali Havonen's paper on seasonality in food prices in Ethiopia. And what he actually showed was that there was more seasonality in the non-staple foods, which you would expect because most of them are perishable. So staple food prices, we've been so concerned about cereal prices for decades, but they're quite storable, whereas your fruits and vegetables and even a lot of seasonality in price of eggs and dairy, etc. So quite striking. And I'll let James answer the other question.
You don't want to do fuel taxes. So the first question, why are we looking at fuel taxes? And the reason why, and this is not necessarily related to ARENA, but it's to this other work that we're doing with the Gates Foundation, is there's so much emphasis on how much more we need to spend in agriculture. And what we were looking at are some of these possibilities for cross-cutting policies that could benefit not just one value chain or one particular product or group of products, but sort of could lead to some kind of systems change. And that might include investing in rural roads, but it might also be reducing fuel taxes. And then we're also focusing on not just agriculture. We're now all focusing on agri-food system transformation. And so we're looking at policies that are maybe not necessarily benefiting farmers, but are benefiting the downstream. And so in the case of fuel taxes, and again, this was work in progress, so please don't cite me on it. It's why I didn't put Tanzania on there. Is the reason why fuel taxes come out quite strongly is because they're such an important part of transaction costs in low-income countries. And so the kinds of products that have very high transaction costs are the ones that are likely to benefit the most from fuel tax reductions, even once we internalize the cost of foregone revenues. And so that's why we've got fuel taxes in the middle, because you remember that products like vegetables and some of these sort of high transaction cost products were the ones that were coming out strongly in the middle as well. So that's a very simplified answer, but it gives you a feel for why we're getting the results we are.
Yes?
Marie, can I briefly just come back to Frank's question about seasonality and this issue of the distinctive feature of the ARENA project in particular, where because we were looking at seasonality on a global basis, we were, and doing so in a very open-minded way, we were able to discover the most extraordinary anomaly about seasonality, quote seasonality, which is that a tremendous amount of previously published seasonality research is actually subject to an artifact in the data, which is in Revise and Resubmit for the journal, so it'll hopefully be coming out within 6 months maybe, to have really a step forward in understanding of seasonality on a global basis, only because we were able to have investigation of seasonality without specifying what place and what thing, because we could mash up northern and southern hemisphere, unimodal and bimodal, and so forth, precisely because we weren't zooming in the way that demand-driven research so often is, we were able to discover this thing. So it's a very interesting question to which we found an even more interesting partial answer, in addition to the points that Derek made about what actual seasonality you could find after you control for the season.
Leslie, did you want? Okay, so more questions, yes? Okay, will you start on this side again?
Yeah, Derek, great work. In particular, like your table on the relative cereal price, you find a large variation in the relative price between developed countries and developed countries. I find that fascinating. The next step to think about the mechanism behind the findings. Maybe in the second phase, you can do more work on this line. So Shenggen did a lot of research to look at the impact of rural infrastructure on agriculture production and non-farm jobs about 20 years ago. So I saw that strand of research related to your research. Mainly rural road and rural electrification matters a lot to nutrition consumption. If you go to rural areas, the biggest problem the farmers, rural people don't eat meat is because they cannot store the meat for a long time. So we see the famine and the feast. Mm-hmm. Only they eat meat during the festivals or after they maybe kill a sheep or a cow for the festival. And the rest of the year they couldn't eat, mainly because lack of refrigerator. So if you have rural electrification, you have rural road, if you increase the demand for the animal products, animal meat, and then the price will drop. Right now, the price is too thin. No people can sell the products in the rural areas, and then further beat up the price. So I think that's the main reason, your lack of agricultural market for animal meat in rural areas because of poor road conditions and the lack of electricity. So probably the next phase, you look at the impact on the role of rural infrastructure. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Danielle from 1000 Days. I had noted down that, Derek, on one of your slides, it said reducing prices of nutrient-rich foods should be a top priority for agriculture. So can you unpack that a little bit and just speak to the policy levers that need to be pushed for that to happen, and in turn, what are then the marching orders for advocates to help make that, elevate that priority? Thanks.
Okay, yes, on this side.
Thank you. Nice work. I have a question on, I've heard Derek mention that yields, increments in yield is actually associated with weight measures of nutrition, but less connected with linear growth. So can you explain why might that be?
Okay, there was another one in the back, please. Oh, sorry, there was one right there. Yeah, let's take this one and then in the back.
Hi, I'm Barbara Coelho. I'm working in that dimension and more in the World Bank, like applying this type of thing. So I was just a little bit, I would like you to talk a little more about you say the intensification and commercialization and how the trade in between this like national, international level, just taking in point a little bit how the value chains today were working into that with gender empowerment as well, and how conditions within the chains and for farmers at the very low of the chain that we know are the poorest might be very disadvantaged. So how can we still decrease the price of eggs or whatever is the thing without decreasing so much, the main value added made by the farmer that we're seeing in France today with milk producers?
Okay, there was a last one in the back, yeah. Please say your name.
My name is Aditya. I'm a student at George Washington University. This is, I guess, a question for the analysis team. The study on dietary patterns and the impact on child stunting. I was wondering if you sort of also found differential impacts by gender, if there's like a story on like a different result for boys or girls, or something like that. Thanks.
Okay, so Derek, you'll go first again.
Yeah, some tough questions, but those James will get those. The work on food prices, yeah, thanks, Jabo. Yeah, we've done a little bit of work on, maybe I can merge these two questions, a little bit of work on rural roads. Actually, so far, we didn't find much. We found that, a lot of when villages are closer to cities, the wealth and education benefits tend to be some of the main differences. So I think we do need to unpack market access. That's something we really want to do in phase 2. Look much more at market level data, not just household and farm level data, but market level data to construct market diversity indices to unpack, how well markets deliver nutritious foods. And it's striking there that in the agricultural economics literature, when we've looked at things like how well markets are working, market integration, same story. We look at cereals. We're not looking at fruits, vegetables, livestock as much. I do think one of the problems for nutrition is that so many nutrient-rich foods are perishable, and so their value chains are more complex. And it's not just roads. So in Ethiopia, they're building roads like a mile a minute. But there's other things missing in the value chains. All these roads are coming along, but the dairy sector is still, in the doldrums, except around Addis Ababa and so on. So these are very complex value chains, and the reasons you mentioned are also why we see the prices we do. So fish is salted and dried, keeps it much more storable, much more tradable. So you see fairly low prices for fish in Africa, but very high prices for eggs. There was, can I go into more detail on the reducing the prices of animal source foods? Well, I think that is an area for future research, but I think there's 2 or 3 dimensions we need to consider. One is this tradability dimension. So eggs, international trade in eggs is very low, something like 95% of the eggs consumed in the world were produced in that country. So it's one of the sort of thinnest markets internationally. Chicken meat is very different. It's very widely traded. Dairy powder, very widely traded, and so on. So some things are more tradable than others. And so countries don't have to produce everything for themselves. They should invest in sectors where they have a comparative advantage and, where there's a natural barrier to imports. So, yeah, I think Channing's in the room. Channing has a really nice recent paper on the poultry sector in Ghana, where there's people are trying to sort of protect the domestic poultry sector from sort of imports from Brazil, but they could import more chicken meat and concentrate the domestic sector on egg production. I think the nutritional benefits could be considerable from that sort of strategy. And this is a challenge that some countries have faced, and we need to learn a little bit more about countries that have reduced food prices through this mix of trade and domestic investment. So I think, for example, dairy in East Asia is a very interesting story. It's a non-traditional dairy consuming region, but dairy consumption has exploded in many parts of Asia through a sort of mix of marketing campaigns, trade, and support to the domestic sector as well. So we need to learn a little bit about some of those success stories as well. On yield growth, the results I showed you from Bangladesh, were not necessarily definitive, but it was quite striking that in areas that saw more growth in rice production, there wasn't any more diversification of diets, there wasn't any more consumption of milk, etc. So, the sort of mutatis mutandis assumption in economics is often, well, if we just increase incomes, then everything else will follow. That's not necessarily true, especially for things like child feeding. So it is more complex. We are doing more work in Africa to try and see whether yield shocks around the time of birth are having more impact on nutrition, but those are preliminary results. So it's a complex relationship. I think another question related to this sort of income-diet trade-off, and maybe James is better placed to handle that. James, you want to chip in here?
Well, I was going to talk about something else, actually.
Well, then, okay. Yeah. Then maybe you finish and he talks about something else and that? Or did you have other questions?
There was another question I had to answer about animal
Okay.
source foods by gender, and the answer is very simple. I can't remember. We ran a lot of robustness tests, but I will check whether we ran that particular one.
In adults or in children? In children, right?
In children, yeah,
I
yeah,
doubt
and
it,
I can't remember. Well, James, actually, I'm going to prep you again, but I thought in the context of the RIAPA model, I mean, one of the goals there is to look at potential trade-offs between income and diets. So, for example, with commercialization of poultry, it is a tricky one because if you try to commercialize the domestic poultry sector, you could bring down the price of eggs. And what does that do to rural backyard poultry systems? Well, I don't think we know, but it's something we have to look at.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I can speak to. So the work that we were presenting there was looking at the way these value chains already are currently configured inside the countries. And so it's true that if smallholders are not currently participating, then the kind of returns we're getting, the sort of weaker returns to poverty, linkages to poverty reduction, are reflecting the status quo. And so it may not necessarily give a definitive answer, but it certainly flags why we need to start looking at alternative configurations. And what we're finding is that whether you believe the models or not, often the decision makers in countries do. And so we can use these models to look at the implications of shifting to different configurations, both in farming systems and in marketing systems, and we can see what kind of difference it makes. And that's actually one of the focuses of the work we're doing on the agriculture side with Gates, to see if we can justify some of these sort of and how one might go about doing some of these reconfigurations. Since I have the mic, what I was going to talk about, and I was thinking more about the question of what we should do now that we've decided more nutritious foods need to be, or more diverse diets need to be realized. And if I think a little bit back to the kinds of work we've been doing over the last decade, I mean, in study after study, we've shown, not necessarily in every study, but in study after study, we've shown that the returns to irrigation, for example, if one's looking at simply growth effects and poverty effects, the returns to irrigation don't always come out being as strong as some of these alternative investments. But that's again a product because we're looking at poverty and growth. And I think once we bring in nutrition, we start to have a far more nuanced, a more balanced portfolio of investments. And so things like irrigation, if you factor in the need to grow more vegetables and so on, suddenly these kinds of investments start to look more attractive. And this is definitely something that's coming out of our studies again and again. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, just to follow up on the comment from 1,000 Days, and just to say that it's this kind of finding, this nuance, that it's not just talking about decreasing prices of any foods, we're talking about decreasing the prices of nutrient-rich foods as what really is kind of the next frontier. And for me, that's exactly the kind of message and the evidence base that goes with it that I would absolutely, as a nutrition staff person at the World Bank, bring front and center to the engagement with my colleagues at the World Bank and the advocacy that we're doing internally, but then of course on to the policy dialogue. It's critical, and I mean I'm ecstatic to see that kind of a finding.
Will, did you have anything you would like to respond to?
Maybe on the question about gender, right? So gender disaggregation is another area where we were able to make an unexpected discovery with Steve Block, who's also in the room, sort of bringing the larger community of people together around the same data on seasonality again as the shock and the timing of birth, and finding something that was consistent with some previous studies, but in a totally new way, that this sort of male fragility hypothesis had some evidence, and that households were responding after the birth and discovering what gender their child was, or what biological sex their child was, protecting the boys more than protecting the girls. And this was in the context of Nepal, but that's an example of something that was quite unexpected and I think quite useful for gender empowerment and programmatic responses to what was a previously hidden sort of phenomenon.
Okay, one last round, and we will also take, I don't know who's taking the questions from online? Yeah. Okay. So why don't we start with that?
I have 3 questions from our online audience. So I have 3 questions from our online audience. Is it coming?
Yeah, that's coming. Yes, it came.
So the first one is from Sid, and he is watching us live from Canada, and he represents private sector mechanism at UN Committee on World Food Security. He asks, if you have the magic stick, which area would you address in terms of policy to address malnutrition? The second question is from Gitachu from University of Verona, Italy, and he is basically asking Derek, he likes the finding that in Ethiopia, chicken ownership affects stunting, but isn't that biased because many rural poor prefer selling chicken and eggs rather than consuming themselves as they are expensive? And the third one is from Tonya. She's from CARE, and she was basically asking speakers to discuss the impact of gender dynamics and women's unequal labor burden on the disconnect between ag and nutrition, and how we can address the challenges like environmental enteropathy. There is a need to ensure we are increasing men's knowledge as well as women's on these issues. Thank you.
All right. We'll take a few more. Yes.
Thanks very much. Really interesting presentations. One thing, when we were focused just on calories and increasing calorie availability, in many respects it was a very simple problem. You wanted to raise productivity of agriculture, that would raise incomes, lower the price of food, and achieve that goal potentially very, very quickly. But with the nutritional objectives, we've got multiple goals here. We want some animal source food, but not too much. We want more diversity and so on. So we've got to have, as Tinbergen taught us, multiple policy interventions. And as McKinnon pointed out, we need to assign the policy interventions to the things that they affect, or should affect most directly. I didn't hear too much of that multiple instrument, multi-goal discussion. Is that something that's really underlying the thinking at the moment, or is it something we should be doing more?
Yeah, I think these trade-offs are very important and relate also to the when we try to make value chains more nutrition sensitive, and people get nervous because value chains are made to make to add value, economic value of the food along the value chain, and then you say, oh yeah, but you need another objective. You really need to make them more nutrition sensitive. So I'll let the speakers respond, but it's a good question. How many more questions? Yeah, okay, to the left. Yeah, we can't take too many more, but we'll just take the 3 I saw, and I will stop looking.
That's a solution.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lynn Brown. I was wondering a little about some of the bigger issues. You haven't talked about agricultural research. So in a sense, the cereal bias starts there. I mean, since the Green Revolution, we've been more cereals, and that was true of the 2007-2008 food price crisis. I was living in Bangladesh, and all the talk was, we have to make rice more productive, because then we'll be okay nutritionally. And I was standing there going, no, you won't. And I think there's a sort of, if you look at the CG, most of it goes to cereals. It doesn't go to fruit and veg, so we don't have delayed ripening or better packaging or any of those sorts of things to protect them. And if you look in Bangladesh, you sort of said they don't diversify the diet. There's no reason why they would. If you're a rice farmer, you're very poor and you know you're going to stay poor. But when the cyclone comes along, you know full well that the government will actually then bail you out. So it will actually turn off all the factory electricity in Dhaka at 8 o'clock at night to protect it for irrigation subsidies in the rice sector. It will give you free seed. It will give you everything to get your rice paddy going. You got cows, fruits and veg, spices, it will give you nothing. So a farmer is far better off to stay poor in rice than to invest in something else. If you talk to women there, they will say they want cows. They regard cows as white gold. Everybody wants cows, but they don't do it because there's no protection whatsoever. So, I mean, I think cereals has a very long reach in terms of the policy biases that it actually creates.
Okay, 2 more quick questions, please. Yes, I had seen you and you.
Yeah, quick questions. James, I really love your map with the overlaying the nutrition and the policies. And I would like if you can go a little bit deep dive, the one that caught my eye, the center vegetables and fuel tax. And what did you take into consideration to look at the fuel tax, vegetables, or any of these policies, for example, the post-harvest loss, the cold chain, etc.? Is that part of what you think? Leslie, I know there is the food safety work is part of what your colleagues do. Is this under the nutrition work? And where do you see that sitting within improving nutrition agenda, or is it that's in the World Bank agenda as a global, or is that separate from what the nutrition you see it as a nutritionist? Especially thinking about what IFPRI under A4NH have been doing at the informal market and the household level food safety, not the formal market. Thank you.
Yes.
Brian Bruns, consulting sociologist. I guess for Arena 2 to ask in terms of potential interventions, especially things like aquaculture or commercialized chicken production, where the private sector is going to have a big role. Are you making some progress, or how do you approach what would be the opportunities or most strategic role for projects or governments in that kind of change? Thank you.
Okay, so we have only 6 minutes for answers, so just select or be brief.
Sure. Well, Will Martin is on Arena 2, so I don't see why I have to answer his question.
That's a good one. Okay, done.
Maybe his answer is the answer to the magic stick question, which is the first. I mean, I don't believe in magic sticks or silver bullets, especially for something as complex and multi-sectoral as nutrition. Except maybe to say, I think it's, I think one thing we don't know enough, I mean, there was a project here called Millions Fed or another called Millions Nourished. I think what we need to understand is economies that really have changed their food systems for the better. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. So Thailand is often talked about in the context of nutrition, but Thailand, made amazing progress at increasing dairy consumption too. How did they do it? A little bit consistent with your remarks, Will. They had behavioural change. They had mass marketing campaigns because dairy was a non-traditional good, and people there didn't necessarily associate dairy consumption with healthy children. And adults, many adults are lactose intolerant, so it doesn't apply as much to children. And then they used some trade, and then they used some investments in the domestic sector to have a domestic supply of fresh milk. And so we can learn from those sorts of food system transformations. I don't think it's a magic stick. It's probably decades of work, more than a magic stick. But I think it's useful. There was a remark about gender and men's knowledge. Well, I completely agree. We haven't looked a lot at gender issues, but I've always thought if men are the problem, you should talk to them and not just women. But so that's all I'll say on that. There was a comment on agricultural R&D. I completely agree. Bangladesh is maybe the most sort of calorie cereal fundamentalist country out there. There's a problem that a lot of the policymakers grew up in times of famine in places like Bangladesh, and they still remember the 73 famine and so on. And I think only about 20% of CGR expenditures are devoted to fish and livestock, roughly. And if we care as much as we say we do about nutrition, I think 20% is a bit low. Arena 2, on livestock, I mean, we're still in livestock investments. We're still thinking that through. I think our current thinking is that we need to actually move a little bit beyond just specific sectors, dairy and poultry, to think about animal source foods in a more integrated way, because some countries have a comparative advantage in one or the other. Some countries can apply trade strategies to increase animal source foods for some sectors and not others. So I think we need a more integrated approach, but that's something we're still working on.
Okay. Anyone else has quick?
Yeah. Maybe I will answer Will's question. I mean, I think that's exactly right. We've got multiple objectives, and we've always had multiple objectives. So, I mean, even when we were just looking at poverty reduction and growth under CADP Phase 1, right, we were still doing trade-offs between, we still identified trade-offs between cereal crop production and the high-value export crops and so on, and we were still making judgment calls on which way to go. And I think even now within poverty, there are trade-offs between, are you talking about reducing rural poverty, national poverty, poverty of women, and now we're in a world of a Malabo Declaration where we've also got to create jobs for young people, we've got to create jobs for youth, we have to also worry about nutrition. And so I think I think the best that we're coming up with is we're actually quantifying the effect of your bias. And so we can show you need a balanced portfolio, and this is what it would look like if you had a poverty bias versus if you had a more dietary diversity bias. But we can't answer the question which bias you should have, and that we just have to live with. Yeah.
Okay, Will, did you want to say a few words?
Maybe just briefly on this question of multiple goals. I think nutritionists have made quite a lot of progress at beginning to synthesize all the different dimensions and sort of think about Goldilocks nutrition in the sense of not too hot, not too cold, not too much, not too little, many different dimensions and all at once. So while clearly there are the multiple dimensions, there is a certain amount of understanding of how to get towards a sweet spot where sort of the interventions involve the marketplace with its own diversity year-round and so forth.
And Leslie?
We can talk a bit more offline about the food safety. It does sit squarely with the Ag GP, but sort of in the spirit of the comment that Will made, I mean, I think we definitely are seeking ever more clarity about the sweet spot as to how the different sectors at the bank work together in order to achieve, in this case, nutrition outcomes, but broadly speaking, to balance all of the competing agendas for where we want to end up.